Hello everyone and welcome to this course on Identity and Access Management. My name is Rohit Rahi and I'm part of the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure team. Identity and Access Management Service enables you to control what type of access a group of users have and to which specific resources. Resources is a cloud object that you create and use in Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, and we will use this term OCI going forward. So these can be compute instances, block storage volumes, virtual cloud networks, basically any kind of resource you create in OCI. Each OCI resource has a unique Oracle assigned identifier, also called as Oracle Cloud ID OCID. This is a term which you will use and see a lot in the Oracle Cloud Infrastructure context. OCI Identity and Access Management Service uses traditional identity concepts such as principals, users, groups, policies, and there is a new feature, a new capability called compartments. Let's look into these. A principal is an IAM entity that is allowed to interact with OCI resources. There are two kinds of principals in OCI: IAM users and instance principals. IAM users are persistent identities set up through the IAM service to represent individual people or applications. When customers sign up for an OCI account, the first IAM user is the default administrator. This default administrator sets up other users and groups within the tenancy. Users enforce security principle of least privilege. So what does that mean? It means two things. First, users have no permissions until they are placed in one or more groups. And secondly, groups have at least one policy with permission to a tenancy or a compartment. And we'll look into all these details and things will become clearer. A group is a collection of users who all need the same type of access to a particular set of resources. So you can think of groups as a storage admin group might be made up of all the admins who deal with storage related resources and so on and so forth. The same user can be a member of multiple groups. Now there is another kind of principle within OCI which is called instance principle. Instance principle lets instances and applications running on those instances to make API calls against other OCI services, removing the need to configure user credentials or a configuration file. So think about it this way: if you have a compute instance and you're running an application on it, the compute instance using this kind of authentication can call other OCI services like object storage without really needing a user credential or a configuration file. The course we are going through right now is a level 100 course, and we are not going to cover instance principle in this course. But we also have a level 200 course on Identity and Access Management Service where we go into more details on things like instance principle and other advanced IAM concepts. So how does OCI work on authentication? IAM service authenticates a principal by three different mechanisms. The first mechanism is simply by username and password. So you use the password to sign into the web console. Administrator will provide you with a one-time password when setting up your account, and at your first login you are prompted to reset the password. This is very simple. This is how most of the web properties work. You have a username password authentication. The second kind of authentication is through something called an API signing key. This is required when using the OCI API in conjunction with the SDKs, the various SDKs we have, or the CLI. Now this key is an RSA key pair in the PEM format, and you can in the OCI console you can copy and paste the PEM public key here as it is shown here in the console. The third mechanism of authentication is through something called an auth token. This is an Oracle generated token string to authenticate with third-party APIs that do not support OCI signature-based authentication. So a good example would be the Autonomous Data Warehouse service. And as you can see here, we are providing the username, and for the password we are providing an authentication token, and using this the APIs for Autonomous Data Warehouse are able to authenticate with the OCI usernames. How does authorization work? Authorization basically specifies various actions an authenticated principal can perform. In case of OCI, the authorization is done by defining specific privileges in these things called policies and associating them with principals. Policies also support security principle of least privilege. By default, users are not allowed to perform any actions, which means that policies cannot be attached to users but only groups. So keep that in mind. It's an important concept. Policies cannot be attached to users but only to the groups. Policies are comprised of one or more statements which specify what groups can access what resources and at what level of access. So there are a couple of examples which are shown here. You write a policy in a human readable format with these keywords. You say allow group, so by default everything is denied. So if you don't write a policy, as we saw earlier, your users, your groups cannot do anything within OCI. So you say allow group, this you provide the group name here. To do something, there's a verb on some kind of resource types in either a tenancy or a compartment, and you can also specify some conditions where some of the conditions you can write advanced conditions there. We'll look into all these in the next few slides. Important to understand that policies can be attached to a compartment or a tenancy. Where you attach, it controls who modifies it or who can delete it. Now we have not gone through the concept of compartment, so just hold on to that. We'll cover that in the next 3 or 4 slides. So how do we really write a policy? We just saw that you write a policy in a human readable format. You say allow subject, this is a group or group name, to do something. There's a verb here on a particular kind of resources in location. This location can be your entire account, your tenancy, or specific compartments. We'll look into what compartments are, and you can also specify some conditions here. So let's look into each of these. So first is the verb. Now verb basically gives you a kind of access, a type of access, level of access. So and there are 4 different levels of access within OCI, starting with inspect, read, use, and manage. And as you go down, your access level increases. You get more access permissions. So first thing is inspect. Using inspect, you can only list resources. There is something called read, which gives you inspect plus ability to get user specified metadata on the actual resource. The third level of access is use, which is read plus ability to work with existing resource, and the actions vary by resource type. But typically rule of thumb is when you give an access of use, this does not include the ability to create or delete that type of resource. If you want to give create or delete, the only option you have is to use level of access called manage. So as you go from inspect to read to use to manage, your level of access increases and you get more access. Now we also looked into this thing called resource type. So what does that look like? There are different resources in OCI, and some of them you can either define the resource types at an aggregate level, or you could define the resource types on individual level. So there is something called all resources resource type, which gives you access to every resource within OCI. So this can be your compute instances, your storage volumes, your virtual cloud networks, everything and anything you can create within OCI. If you don't want your users and your groups to get that level of access on resources, on all resources, you could further limit their access depending on the resource type. So if you have a group which is only concerned with database, you could define a policy on a database family level. If you want to define a policy even more granular, you could do so by using individual resource types. And you can see here all the resource families within OCI, whether it's database, instances, compute instances, objects, storage, virtual cloud network. Each of them you can write a policy at the family level, at the aggregate level, or you could go very granular at the individual resource level. You could do that. So the whole idea here is we are giving you granular role-based access control. Now there is also one concept which is very important to understand, is when you write a policy giving a group access to a particular verb meaning the level of access they have, and a resource type, whether it's aggregate or database or virtual network or storage, what you are actually doing is you are giving that group access to one or more predefined permissions. Permissions are the atomic units of authorization that controls a user's ability to perform specific API operations on resources. The keyword here is API operations on resources. So let me give you an example. We have a volume family here, right? We looked into different kinds of resources. There's block volumes, and there's a aggregate resource type called volumes family. Now within that we can have different levels of access as we looked earlier. So there's inspect, read, use, and manage. Manage having the highest level of access. Now if you look at each of these verbs also have a permission, and the permission leads to an API operation. So for example, your inspect verb has a permission called volume inspect, which means you can inspect a volume, and there are two kinds of API operations you can perform as part of that permission. You can list volumes and you can get volumes. And as you go from inspect, read, use, and manage, the level of access generally increases and the permissions granted are cumulative. We saw this earlier. So if you come to the use access, you can see here it says read plus, so it's getting everything from there, and then it has a couple of more permissions. If you come to manage, you can see that it says use plus, so it has all these permissions here, and then it adds a few more permissions. And the way you use these API operations is each API operation requires the caller to have access to one or more permissions. So for example, to use list volumes or get volumes, you must have access to a single permission called volume inspect. If you don't have that level of permission, then your API operation cannot be executed. So this is how it works behind the scenes. It's important to understand that when you specify a verb and you specify a resource type, this is how it works behind the scenes. Let's look at some of the common policies. So the first policy is a very simple policy. It says network admins can manage a cloud network. So you say allow group network admins. In this case, this group network admins will be comprised of folks who really are concerned about network, and they manage the network within an organization. And then you say manage, which is the highest level of permission or access, virtual network family. So you are giving them writing a policy so they can manage the entire virtual cloud network family and all the components in tenancy meaning your account. Very simple. This is the simplest form of policy you could write. Policies can become more complex. So this is an example of a complex policy. You want a few people who can write to object storage. Let's call them object writers. They need to have a policy so they can write to object storage. So the way you write this policy is you could say allow group object writers to manage. Again, you are giving them all the permissions. Objects in compartment. Now you are doing compartment here. You're writing a compartment. So there is no more tenancy, but you are limiting to a specific part of your account. We'll look into what compartments actually are. And you can make them more complex. You could just stop here, or you could write these where conditions here, starting from right here, right? So you could say, I'm giving all kind of verbs here, all kind of access here. Manage is the highest level of access you could give, but you are limiting the ability for these guys to manage objects by saying that they can only create objects and they can only inspect objects. So for example, they cannot delete objects, because manage gives you the ability to create, delete, inspect, read, everything, right? Now you are saying in this policy, you are saying that they can manage, but I write a where condition where I'm saying they can only create and they can only inspect. So you could write policies like that. The next policy here is similar, but the difference is we have something called request.operation, and it is the same thing, create object and list objects. In the previous policy, we had something like request.permission here. So what it means is when you write a conditional statement, you could specify your variables, and request is an object. You could say either the variable can be on the permission, or the variable can be on specific API operations. If I have to pick the one which I prefer, you always go with request.permission, because in the future, if there is a new API which gets added into the same permission, you don't have to change your policy. If you do this, it's very granular, and if there is a new API being added, then you will have to go and write that policy again. But just keep in mind that you can also combine both of these. So you could say request.permission, write a permission here, and you could specify further restrict it by saying request.operation. So just keep in mind that the policies can be pretty advanced, and there's a whole section we cover in level 200 course where we go into more advanced pieces of policies. There is one exception here which I wanted to cover, is in most of times when you write a policy, you would say allow group, and this is, as we discussed earlier, policies are specified at a group level. You cannot write policy for a user. There is one exception where we say allow service, so it's no more a group here, but you are allowing a service to access another service, for example, right? So in this case, block storage and object storage want to encrypt and decrypt volumes and buckets. So they have to use a service which is called key management, and they have to use object called keys and vaults. So in order for that to work, you have to write a policy which allows these particular services, block storage and object storage, to use the key management service and the components like keys and vaults. So this is an exception to the way you write your policies. And again, if you go on to our OCI documentation, you can read more about how policies work for specific services. Okay, so we said a few slides back that we will look into compartments. It's a unique feature of OCI. A compartment is a collection of related resources like VCN instances that can be accessed only by groups that have been given permission by an administrator in your organization. So compartments help you organize and control access to your resources. Now, what are the design considerations for compartment? Each resource belongs to a single compartment, but resources can be connected or shared across compartments. What it means is you can create a resource like a virtual cloud network, and a virtual cloud network can have multiple subnets, 0 or more subnets. A VCN and its subnets can live in different compartments. It's completely possible. Compartment can be deleted after creation, and it can also be renamed. Compartment can have subcompartments, which can be up to 6 levels deep. So you create a root compartment, a parent compartment, and you can create hierarchies which can be up to 6 levels deep. A resource cannot be reassigned to a different compartment after creation. So you create a resource, it lives in that compartment, you cannot move it. There is one exception in case of buckets where you can move your resources from one compartment to the another. After creating a compartment, you need to write at least one policy for it. Otherwise, it cannot be accessed except by administrators or users who have permission to the tenancy. Subcompartments inherit access permissions from compartment higher up its hierarchy. And this is again a concept which can get very complex, and we cover this in our level 200 course. When you create a policy, you need to specify which compartment to attach it to, or you could attach it to the tenancy, or you could attach it to specific compartments. So let's look at a reference model for compartments. So as you can see here, we have a tenancy. This is my actual account. I have created groups which have users, and we have written specific policies for those groups. Now there is a compartment which is called network infrastructure. This is this one here. Now this compartment can house critical network infrastructure which have to be centrally managed by network admins. So the things which can live here can be the top level VCN, my virtual cloud networks, the security list, my gateways, all the different kind of gateways which are possible, my firewalls. This is basically my demilitarized zone, DMZ. In addition, we can have compartments for dev, prod, and test networks. Now these are modeled as separate compartments to easily write policies about who can use the network. So whether dev people have access to the whole production network or not, probably you don't want to do that. So you can have separate compartments, and these compartments can have subnets, database, storage, other resources, but they don't have things like your firewalls. They don't have things like access to your gateways, because those things are being controlled right here in your network infrastructure compartment. There's also compartment where these compartments are used by particular team or projects, and the whole purpose is you separate them because they might be doing different things, right? So you can have a project A, project B, project C. These can be different projects, and you can have compute instances, your databases, your block volumes, multiple of these, one per team that needs its own DevOps environment. So the net here is compartments are a very powerful concept, and you can use them in multiple ways. This is just one reference model where we have seen customers who create their networks with different kinds of compartments, and then they have compartments for individual teams or individual departments. When you sign up for OCI for the first time, as we discussed earlier, you get your tenancy, right? This is your account. Now with tenancy, you also get this thing called a root compartment. Remember, we just went through this, that compartments can have 6 levels of hierarchies. The first, your tenancy, there is something called a root compartment, which is the parent compartment. Oracle sets up a default administrator for the account, and Oracle also sets up the root compartment. You don't have to create this. We also create a default administrators group, and this cannot be deleted. There has to be at least one user in it. You can have multiple users. If you place multiple users in this group, they will have full access to all resources. Now we also write a default policy here which goes something like this: allow group administrators, so this group here, to manage highest level of access, all resources, everything in your tenancy, in my tenancy, in tenancy. So this policy cannot be deleted. This is something which is written by us. So just to summarize, when you open an account, you get a root compartment, that is like the parent compartment. We create administrators group. We set up a default administrator, we put that in an administrators group, and we write a policy we give to you. You cannot delete this policy. You cannot delete this group. The group needs to have at least one users. You can add more users, you can delete users, but you at least needs to have one user in there. Now the thing is, just by the nature of it, it's a compartment here, so you can put all your resources in your root compartment. There is nothing which prevents you from doing that, but it's not a good best practice. The best practice, as we saw in the previous slide, is to create dedicated compartments when you need to isolate resources. That's the best practice, something which you should follow. Resource location. It's important to understand where the resources are located. As we saw, identity access management resources are global. Some other resources which are global include things like your keys, your DNS services, of course, global. And then there are specific resources which are availability domain specific or a region specific. Subnet is a construct which is specific to an AD. Compute instances, block volumes, and DB systems live in any AD, because again these are physical things which have to which have to live in a data center. File system and mount target, that is the NFS file service we have, is also AD specific. And ephemeral public IPs which you get with your compute instances is also availability domain specific. Everything else is regional. All the resources, all other resources you create. Now this is an important concept as you are disaster recovery. It's important to understand versus what is not. Now OCI also supports federation, and we support federation with Oracle Identity Cloud Service or Microsoft Active Directory. We also support any identity provider that supports SAML 2.0 protocol. Now, what are the steps to set up federation? First, a federation trust, and this is a simplified setup list of things you have to do, but it goes something like this. First, a federation trust is set up between the identity provider and OCI. Any person in the company, once you set that up, any person in your company who accesses the OCI console is prompted with a single sign-on experience provided by the identity provider. So as you can see here, you get this kind of a prompt here where you can specify your identity provider. In this case, I'm saying it's coming from Oracle Identity Cloud Service, and user signs it with the login password that they have already set up with the IDP, and use it to sign into OCI. IDP authenticates the user, and then that user can access OCI resources. Now, alternatively, if the federation is not set up, you could use your own authentication, which we saw earlier. One of the three mechanisms: provide your username and password, and you can authenticate and access OCI resources. So with that, we covered a lot of ground. We looked into principles, we looked into authentication, we looked into authorization done through policies, we looked into examples of various kind of policies you can write, some more advanced than others. We looked into compartment, we looked into the reference model for compartments, we looked into where the resources live, whether they are global, regional, or AD specific. And then we looked into federation, just a high-level overview of how federation works with OCI. So now with all this, let me give you a quick demo of how OCI Identity and Access Management Service works. So let me get out of my PowerPoint slides here and access my browser and bring up the OCI console. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the URL for my OCI console, and the URL goes something like console.us-phoenix-1.oraclecloud.com. Now I'm logging into my Phoenix region. As we saw in our first module, we have 4 regions which are generally available today. Commercial regions, GA today. You could use other regions as well. I'm logging into Phoenix here. So the first thing I see here as I log in is I see this single sign-on because I have set up identity, or I can just use my username and password to authenticate. I also get prompted for my cloud tenant. This is my account, so I have to provide that tenant name here. So my tenancy is called internal Oracle Rohit, and I click continue on this. And now as I do that, either I can do single sign-on, or I could do my normal authentication with username and password if I don't want to use SSO. So I would use my other authentication. and as I provide that those credentials, I am logged into my OCI console. So the first thing you see here is this is my home page. It has a bunch of things on the right hand side. I can see my health dashboard. I can see if there is kind of a action for me to do something. There are some news, there is blog posts, some documentation, there are a bunch of things on how to get started, learn about different services, and there's a quick launch menu here. I could do a bunch of things like launch a VM instance, create a database, etc, etc. So right here on the top menu, I see the different regions. I can see the 4 commercial generally available regions: Frankfurt, Ashburn, London, and Phoenix. I'm in Ashburn region, that's fine. And on the left hand side, I can see the menu with different services. Today we have around 20 services which are available in OCI, and the list is growing very fast, growing very quickly. So you can see all the services from compute, storage, networking, database, edge, bunch of developer services, identity, etc. So for this module, we are looking into identity and access management service. So I'll click on identity, and as I do that, I can see identity comprises of users, groups, policies, compartments, federation, dynamic groups, etc. Right? We looked into a bunch of these. So I'll click on users here. First thing I have to do in my account is I have to set up a user. As you can see here, I have various users who are already set up in my account. These are the folks who are on my team, and we share this account, or at least they are in added as user in my own personal account. So first thing I'll do is I'll create a user. Now let's call this a training user, because we are talking about training today. So training users, training user 1, and I create this user. Now as I create this user, scroll down, I can see that this user got created, and we discussed this earlier. Every resource gets its own unique identifier called OCID, and you can see this OCID here. If I click on this link here, expand that link, I can see this long string here, right? So this is my OCID. Now I created this user. Next thing I need to do is I can see that this user doesn't belong to any group, and there are a bunch of things I could specify here, like auth token. I could specify the API keys, etc. I could do those. So let me create a group here, and I call this group. I have a bunch of groups already created, but I'll create a group here which is called training group. Okay, so I create a training group, and now as I created this training group, let me add a member. There is no user right now to this group, so I can add any of these users, but I'll add the training user to this particular group. So we created a user, we created a group, we added that user into the group. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to create some resources for that particular user, right? So I come back to identity, and we will create a compartment, because the best practice is not to use the root compartment and put resources in there. I can see that I have a root compartment here, but I don't want to touch it. Let it be like that. I will create a new compartment for my training users. So I would say the compartment name is training, and this is fine. Compartment for training users, and it's asking me for a parent compartment. Remember, we talked about the fact that your root compartment is the parent for your account. This is when you create a tenancy, you get this root compartment. So I'll click create compartment here, and now what I have done is I've created a compartment called training, and as you can see, I have a bunch of compartments already created here, but we have created a compartment called training, and this particular compartment right now has no policies, so it's not useful. If I want to create a resource, I would not be able to create a resource in this compartment. If I can see here, you can see that I can see the list of my compartments on the left hand side. So let's create a policy here. So I click on create policy, and this is my training policy. And let's start with a very simple policy, because we want to keep it simple, because this is just the intro course. So we'll say allow group training group, because this is the group we created, to manage, give them all the highest level of access, all resources. We could say tenancy here, that would give them access to the whole tenancy, or we don't want that, we could say compartment, because remember we created a compartment specifically for these users called training. So now we are saying allow group training group, this is the group we created, we added a user to that, to manage all resources. They could do everything, they could create all resources, delete them, inspect them, but where? Only in the compartment training. So they cannot do create a resource, for example, in the root compartment. They can only do create a resource in the training compartment, right? And I would create this compartment. Now one thing which I didn't really specify is I could have created this policy within the compartment itself, attach it to this particular compartment, wrote this policy in the root. You can see here root compartment, and I deliberately did that because it's easier for me to manage, but I could have done otherwise. Now if I had done that, I would have restricted who could modify it or who could delete it, right? So keep that in mind. So now we created this policy. So we created a user, we created a group, added the user to the group, we created a compartment, and we wrote a policy for that compartment, right? Now let's see how this works. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the training user, and I'm going to generate a password for it, because we will log in as that particular user. So I see that the password is generated here, so I copy that, and now in my browser I'll open a new incognito window, and I'll log into Phoenix, my cloud region, and I will now log in as that particular user, not as myself as the administrator. So this is my tenancy, and right here it's asking me for a username and a password. So my username is for training user 1, and I click sign in. Okay, let me check. Training user 1, and let me just specify a new password. Oops. Now I'm logged in here as you can see, I'm logged in as training user 1. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create something in my root compartment. So we have not covered virtual cloud networks, but I'll just bring this up, and I'll pick a compartment. I'll say root compartment, and I'll say create a VCN in this root compartment. Name my VCN as a test VCN, and just go ahead and create it. And I click on create virtual cloud network. And the first thing you will see here is I am not allowed. It gives me an error saying not authorized or not found, meaning that I cannot create this resource in this particular compartment because I have no access to this particular compartment, right? And this is how we want it to be, because remember we gave the access only to the training compartment. Now you can see here this particular person here, training user 1, can only access the training compartment. He has no visibility into any other compartment, so they don't even show up in his drop down here. So if I click on training now, it says create a virtual cloud network. So let me just repeat what we just did. Create a test VCN and create all the resources, and click on create virtual cloud network. And now you will see that I'm able to create my virtual resources, virtual cloud network in this compartment. So and I can go and change my permissions. I can have multiple groups for folks who are storage admins or network admins or compute admins, but you get the idea. My access is limited only to that compartment, so I can only access that particular compartment. So that hopefully was a quick demo where we created a user, we created a group, we added that user into the group, we created a compartment, we wrote a policy, and then using that policy I was able to, when I logged into my console as a particular user, because I had a specific kind of policy. I had access to only that compartment, and I could go very granular and write complex policies in for that particular compartment. So resuming with our course, let's look at two more additional concepts which go with identity and access management. So the first thing is tagging. Tagging allows you to customize the organization of your resources, control tag spam, and you could do these are really powerful. Now there are two kinds of tags we support in OCI today. One is called free-form tags. This is what you see with every cloud provider. You have a key and you can provide a value. There is no defined schema or there is no access restriction. OCI has this unique capability called defined tags. Now the defined tags are contained in a namespace and they are secured with policy. So what exactly does that mean? Let me talk about this a little bit more. A tag namespace is a container for tag keys with tag key definitions. So what does it look like? So you create a namespace. For example, there's namespace called operations, and within that you can define a key called environment. And as you can see here, that my tag is comprised of my namespace, my key, and then you can provide a value here. So the tag would go something like operations.environment, and you can have a value of production in there. They cannot, the tag key definition or a tag namespace cannot be deleted, but you can retire them. Retired tag namespaces and key definitions can no longer be applied to resources, but you can reactivate a tag namespace or tag key definition that has been retired, and then you can start using them again. So it's a very powerful way for you to have specific kinds of tags, and you have more flexibility and power in defining those. OCI also has this service called audit, and it automatically records calls to OCI service endpoints as log events. Log information shows time of API activity, source and target of the activity, action and response. All OCI services support audit logs, and you can perform diagnostics, resource usage, monitor compliance, collect security related events using audit logs. So in summary, Identity and Access Management Service enables you to control what type of access a group of users have and to which specific resources. We looked into two kinds of principles within OCI: Identity Access Management users you create, and instance principles. We looked into authentication, can be done by three different mechanisms: username, password, API signing keys, or auth tokens. We looked into authorization, which is done by writing policies and associating them with principle. We looked into the policy syntax, and we looked into specific examples of policies, including a few advanced policies. We looked into compartment. It's a unique OCI feature which can be used to organize and isolate related cloud resources. We actually looked into a demo of all these capabilities. We created a user, created group, created compartment, wrote policies, and then we looked into how that policy gave specific access to the particular users and the group. OCI supports both free-form tags and defined tags with a schema, and you can secure them by policies. And then OCI audit service automatically record calls to OCI service and API endpoints as log events, and you can use this for your compliance activities. So with that, thank you for joining me for this course on Identity and Access Management Service. I look forward to seeing you for the next course on Virtual Cloud Network.